All right, we are back here on the Just and the Suffering podcast, catching up what's going on with the Giants here. A little bit of NFL playoff talk too. Join me today, great friend of the podcast. He covers both New York teams for the Star Ledger. Darryl Slater is here. Darryl, how are you?
I'm doing great. Thanks for having me.
Thanks for coming back. I also want to start here with the Giants because obviously the Jets is not much going on right now. The Giants, I felt like this season was so strange, particularly after the bye, watching how this thing sort of crumbled. So you obviously saw a lot of this up close. So what was it like seeing this Giants ball sort of pick up steam and just go snowballing down the hill after the bye?
Yeah, no, I mean that's a great word for it. They really snowballed into a disaster, and then of course they beat the Eagles and they're 4-7, and everyone's feeling relatively good. I mean, but it turns out Daniel Jones hurts his neck in that game, winds up ending his season. They don't win the rest of the season. They're 0, they finish 0-6. And I think, ultimately Joe Judge probably would have survived that if not for, his really bizarre 11-minute press conference rant where he talked about, players knocking on his door, begging to come back next year. He talked about players on other teams who left, were saying they wish they were still with the Giants. I mean, it was very bizarre. He took some not so veiled shots at Pat Shurmur, the former Giants coach, and also at Ron Rivera. So that John Mara was not happy about that. And I think the quarterback sneaks in the last game, obviously not happy about that either. But I think it was more so that press conference and the losing, of course, albeit without the quarterback, that doomed Joe Judge, and the fact that GMs are going to look at this and say, why do I want to inherit this guy as my coach? And that was going to hamper the Giants GM search. So Joe Judge had his flaws. I think the Giants were probably more flawed than Joe Judge was, if that makes sense. The reason they were terrible was beyond just him and more than just his fault. But he didn't help the matters, and more importantly, he didn't help himself by the way he conducted himself down the stretch. And it's pretty crazy that a Bill Belichick disciple talked himself out of a job, but that's kind of what happened here. More than just kind of, it really is what happened here if you look at it. And the bottom line too is that it's not like the offense was humming along before Daniel Jones got hurt. They were worse without him, but they were pretty bad with him. Whether that was with Jason Garrett as the coordinator, and then Freddie Kitchens only had Daniel Jones for one game, and the Giants did beat the Eagles, but the offense was still pretty bad in that game. So yes, it really did snowball, and now they're looking for a new head coach and a new GM.
Yeah, I mean, we knew the GM change was coming. It basically had been known, I think, by Halloween, sort of hinted that Dave Gettleman was going to retire after the season here. But I think Joe Judge, I mean, I felt like he was pretty safe until he started opening his mouth and talking about these things. And I don't know if you agree, but I feel like he did sort of make the decision to fire himself, basically, by doing all these strange things and making his job really untenable for the Giants to bring him back. And we saw with all the empty seats in the last game of the season that, I think it would have a very hard sell for Mara to go back to the fan base and say he's coming back for another year.
He did fire himself. That's a good way of putting it. I mean, he did. I mean, he talked himself out of a job. This guy is emotional and wound tight, but for the most part, he had kept it between the lines with saying, the right things during the course of his two seasons. But he was very defensive about the way he did things, which I think John Mara thought was fine. At first, certainly with the way he conducted practices, but then he just couldn't stop. And I think in that 11-minute thing, if he just does that, gives a Cliff Notes version of it with the less insane stuff taken, or the more insane stuff taken out, I think it's probably fine. But he was asked a very simple question about why fans should trust him, and he just kept going and going and going, and it kept getting stranger and stranger. I think, yes, it would have been a hard sell with the fans, but more importantly, a hard sell for the GM candidates. They want to attract sought-after GM candidate from outside the organization. I mean, they're not going to promote Kevin Abrams. And why would a GM want to come in and inherit Joe Judge, a hot seat coach, as his coach? And now I think the one thing you look at it and say, well, the GM would have kind of got a freebie year to evaluate the roster. He could have fired Judge after the season. But what happened is, if Judge had a good year, you're stuck with this guy. So, it wasn't entirely Joe Judge's fault that he got fired. because the roster was a disaster of Dave Gettleman's making, but I do think it ultimately was the correct and most pragmatic move, and Judge made the decision easier by running his mouth.
Yeah, I think the scenario you described, where if the GM comes in and Judge was kept and Judge had a good year, I feel like they've been going down the 2013 Jets road where Idzik gets brought in, Rex Ryan's a good year, they're forced to stick together, and they're both gone the year after. Would not have been good scenario for the Giants to play out.
Right, exactly. These arranged marriages very rarely work, and that certainly is one where it did not work. I mean, Rex Ryan went 8-8 in that first year, and they kept him. Now, in that situation, it's not like the GM had full power over the coach. Now, the Giants have made it clear that the new GM is going to have say over the coaching hire and over the coach when he's here. So presumably that means he can fire the coach. So the Jets did go 8-8 that first year in 2013. They kept Rex Ryan, proved to be fool's gold. They were a disaster in 2014, and then both guys got fired. So, I mean, if you're going to hire a GM and trust him, you want to at least give him his ability to hire his own coach. So I guess from the Giants' perspective, they look at it and say, well, why not just do that from the get-go? Why not just give him that ability from the get-go? And that's what's going to happen. I mean, the GM will lead the search for the new head coach. I asked John Mara very directly on his video chat press conference the other day, will this GM be able to hire whichever coach he wants without final say from you? And he basically said, no, ownership has final approval, but this will be ultimately, I presume, it's not like he's going to ask to hire, I can't even think of a terrible coaching candidate, but I'm sure the candidate will be fine enough for ownership to say, yep, rubber stamp, go ahead. So they better make sure they nail this GM hire because they're putting a lot of trust in whoever it is they hire.
Yeah, and the GM hired instantly because obviously we're recording on Tuesday morning. They finished the first round of virtual interviews yesterday. The list of candidates I feel like is very impressive. They got a lot of people outside the organization, which they have not done since George Young. I feel like it needs to be done here. So when you look at the list of people they assembled here, what do you think about the candidates they're looking at?
Good. I think, all 9 of the known candidates are outside candidates. They wrapped up their initial round of interviews. This was all done via Zoom yesterday on Monday. So from Wednesday to Monday, they did 9 interviews. And I think if you go through this list, there's certainly some attractive candidates. I think you have to consider, the Bills' Joe Shane, Ryan Poles from the Chiefs, Monty Ossenfort from the Titans, Joe Ortiz from the Ravens, and then probably Adam Peters from the 49ers would be probably the front runners, and the other guys being Adrian Wilson from the Cardinals and Quentin Harris from the Cardinals, Ryan Cowden. I guess you could put him in the front runner from the Titans, and then Rand Carthorne from the Niners. Those are sort of the lower profile candidates, but I guess Peters is a guy and who's been talked about as a future GM for a little while. Shane as well, Poles too. He's gotten interest from the Vikings and Bears. So I think the Monty Ossenfort one would make a lot of sense because of the Patriots background if they had kept Joe Judge. Not saying it won't make sense now, but he's got some interest from the Vikings. I believe he talked to the Bears as well. So yes, they've gone at they've. There's been a legit search. I mean, it's not like 2017. At the end of 2017, they hired Dave Gettleman. The only other guys they interviewed were Mark Ross and Kevin Abrams, internal candidates, and then Louis Riddick from ESPN, and that was it. It was a 4-interview search, not even a search. It was quick. It was not thorough, and it really only involved one true outside candidate because Dave Gettleman had previously worked for the Giants. So they're not going in that direction now, and I think this is the wise approach. Now, you can do the wise approach, which is look outside and then let your new GM hire the new coach. I think both of those things are smart, and the Giants are doing that. But ultimately, the owner still has to hire a competent GM, and that's where the buck goes back to John Mara in that case. So let's see if he's able to do that. But I think the search has been good so far. I mean, there's nothing really to say it's been a flawed process, and now they just have to figure, as you and I are talking here on Tuesday, what's the process going to be for narrowing the list down to finalists? And I'm sure they'll obviously talk to those people in person.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, obviously they're working right now. Going to pick the GM. I think the goal is hopefully end of this week, early next week, they have a GM in place and they start looking for the coach. And it's interesting you brought your question from the press conference of John Mara about whether he would have final say on the coach situation, because we've already heard reports that they love Brian Daboll, they love Brian Flores, and you know that Mara has fallen in love with coaches before. Like, do you see a scenario where Mara has his new GM? His new GM says, "Hey, I want to hire Kellen Moore as my coach," and he says, and Mara says, "Should we take another look at Brian Daboll or Brian Flores?" Could you see something like that happening?
I mean, you'd hope not. If this is going to be a truly unilateral decision for the new GM, you would hope that John Mara gets the heck out of the way and lets the guy do his job. But I suppose it's possible. Brian Flores is certainly worth taking a look at, as I wrote this week. But he's got a big ego. I mean, obviously, with how things ended in Miami, not entirely his fault. I mean, their ownership is a mess, but I think the new GM will have to figure out if he wants Brian Flores and say, hey, can I actually work with this guy? Can I work cohesively with him? Is Brian Flores going to be willing to let me, as the GM, run the show? Because he didn't want that. Brian Flores wanted the full say in Miami. He just got fired. So I don't know how much the guy's personality and mindset will have changed in the short period of time since he got let go. I mean, good coach, and certainly a proven coach in terms of being able to do some things with the Dolphins roster that maybe are better than expected. But yeah, I would think and hope that John Mara would let the GM get out of the way and let the GM do what he is told the GM he's going to let him do, which is hire the coach.
Yeah, and I also want to go to a couple of player questions of the Giants too, because obviously we've also heard the rumors with some of these quarterbacks in other markets saying, I would be interested in playing with the Giants. Or the rumors about Russell Wilson, or the rumors about Deshaun Watson if his legal situation gets cleared up here. And my question is, obviously, the Giants have the picks to make a trade. And do you think it's worth it for them? Does it make sense to them to try and get the top play quarterback right now if those guys say, I want to come play in New York?
No, I don't think it makes sense for, I get that they want to come play in New York, but I mean, look at that line. It's a disaster. I know Russell Wilson has had to deal with a bad line in Seattle, so I don't know if it makes a lot of sense for them or for the Giants. I mean, the problem is, running it back with Daniel Jones another year. I mean, that's a tough sell for fans who are tired of Daniel Jones, but I don't think the Giants, if you do that, if you go get a Russell Wilson or like Aaron Rodgers, Deshaun Watson, I mean, you probably are a team that feels like you're on the cusp of being a win now team, and the Giants are not there yet. I mean, they're not going to be a win now team in 2022. So I don't know how much sense it makes. I can understand these guys wanting to put that out there for, maybe they feel like they do want to play in New York, even if the team stinks. But leverage certainly. If you want, to drive up your market or whatever, whether it's, trying to get what you want out of your current team or whatever, certainly floating that out there and potential interest would add to your leverage. But it just doesn't make a lot of sense to me. I don't think that, bringing in Russell Wilson would go ahead and change everything for the Giants, from being a 4 or 6 win team to being an 11 or 12 win team. And that's the goal. If you bring in Russell Wilson and you're taking on that contract, that's the goal. It's not to be, an 8 and 9 team. It's to be a team that's, contending for a Super Bowl, because that's what he wants to.
Oh yeah, for sure. And I think obviously the big problem here that the new GM's going to inherit is basically that the cap situation Dave Young left behind is a disaster. They only have like $3 million in cap room. There's no easy guys say, cut A, B, and C, where you have $35 million in cap room. So you wonder here if this is more appealing in the sense to a GM that, hey, they can tell the fans, look, it's a mess. We're going to use 2022 to fix the cap, evaluate Jones some more, get some young players in here, trade back, get some more picks, and just sort of get right, and then next year try and add jet fuel, whatever we're doing here. Do you think that's sort of the play for the new GM?
Yeah, I don't think trying to rush into a quick fix in 2022 makes a lot of sense, because I don't even know, it's not even really possible, considering that, usually you make most of your win now moves in free agency, and they don't have the cap space to do it because they made, they did dumb things like signing Kenny Golladay last year that has handcuffed them cap-wise, and Dave Gettleman also restructured a lot of contracts in order to free up cap space, which also has hamstrung them cap-wise entering 2022. So their cap situation is not in a good spot. This is going to have to be a draft-oriented rebuild, at least early on in the process here. They do have a lot of draft capital. And so you look at it and say, well, do you want to blow all that draft capital for one player when you're not going to be able to put, win now free agency pieces around him? Or do you go ahead as the new GM and just try to deliberately rebuild through the draft, even if that means trading back? Or they got 5 picks in the first 3 rounds. If you look at the Tankathon draft power rankings, the Jets are 1, the Giants are 2. So they have an enormous amount of draft capital, the Giants do, and they could use that. I mean, if you're a team that is on the cusp of feeling like you can break through, maybe use that to go ahead and go get a player. And the Jets are probably to a point here where they need to push for the playoffs next year. So maybe that's a bit more of a mindset for them, even though they're not going to trade for a quarterback. But I don't think the Giants are there yet. I mean, the cap is a disaster. And then, so even if the GM nails all 5 of these premium picks in the first 3 rounds, how many of those guys are going to be like breakout stars as rookies? It's hard to imagine them going 5 for 5 in that, even if all 5 wind up becoming productive players. So, yes, it's going to be another likely long year for the Giants. I would guess likely with Daniel Jones. Maybe they bring in a veteran who can challenge him or whatever, or replace him eventually. The decision comes here this offseason by early May on what they want to do with his fifth-year option. And so, look, I think the new GM could certainly decline it because it's $21 million fully guaranteed for 2023. If you go ahead and decline it, and he has a great year, you could franchise tag him. And if you decline it and he has a bad year, then you're not on the hook for anything in 2023. So I think that probably that's the best course of action. Decline it, wait and see, and then you always have the franchise tag to keep the guy under your control for 2023 if that's what you want to do.
Yeah, I think it makes some sense. I want to touch on your point also about the idea of them trading picks for players. I think you made a good point with the Jets being a different spot than the Giants are. They have to try and go for next year. I think, for example, if the Jets find a number 1 receiver on the trade market, they could consider using some of the picks to go get that guy, help their offense out. The Giants, if you trade away a couple of picks for Deshaun Watson or Russell Wilson, you still have to replace all those guys plus all the cap room. It doesn't make sense for them to make that kind of move.
I mean, it's not like the Jets they have a perfect roster, but the Jets have the cap flexibility in addition to the draft capital, so they could take on a prominent player, even if that doesn't mean Joe Douglas going out and splurging in free agency. So they have the flexibility to go sign big free agents, which I don't think Joe Douglas would do. I think it's more of probably a volume approach is appropriate because they do have multiple holes in their roster, but they can certainly go out and take on a big contract and ship out some draft picks to get a really prominent player. Albeit obviously not a quarterback, or they can just go ahead and not trade the picks. They can make the picks or trade back and make more picks, address it by volume in the draft, and then address it by volume in free agency too. So I think that's the situation for the Jets because, yeah, like you look at them and you think like, oh, well, how can you say that they should be trying to push for a playoff spot? Well, look, I mean, this is going to be the situation. They don't have a new GM. I mean, this is really the 3rd true offseason for Joe Douglas because he didn't get hired till after the draft and free agency in 2019. So this is his 3rd true offseason. The clock is now ticking on him. The honeymoon is over. Even if people, look at Robert Saleh and have a little more patience with him because last year was his first year. So Joe Douglas needs to push for results in 2022. And that simply means, I think, if you're the Jets, can you be a 9-8 team? Now, 9-8 teams missed the playoffs this year, as we saw, even with the extra wild card. A bunch of them did. So if the Jets are 9-8 and they're in it to the end and they miss the playoffs, or maybe they make it, certainly if they make it, it's a success. I think then you can say, okay, there's some progress here. They need to be relevant. I mean, then that's got to be the goal. So Joe Douglas needs to make moves this offseason to make them relevant. And that doesn't just mean, picking a few players in the draft and maybe some of them work out and some of them don't. I think you got to take bigger swings than that. If that, whether that means, trying to get a guy in free agency or trading for someone.
Absolutely. I want to wrap up here a couple of quick things in the playoffs. Obviously, Super Wildcard Weekend, the sequel was not as good as the original. The games were pretty much blowouts, with the exception of 2. And I got to say, I'm worried as a fan. I know the extra playoff spot is fun, but part of me worries that, going forward, we're going to have a lot more weekends like this where teams that just barely get in don't belong on the field with 2 seeds, and they're going to have problems like this going forward.
Yep, exactly. I mean, from a competitive, I can understand why the NFL did it from a revenue standpoint, certainly, because people are going to watch bad NFL games. That's just the way it is. I mean, whether it's for gambling or whatever, people are going to watch these games. But from a competitive standpoint, yeah, I mean, you look at last year. Indy was a 7 seed; they lose by 3 to Buffalo. The Bears were the 7 seed in the NFC, and they get whacked down in New Orleans. So 3 of the 4 7 seeds, including both of them this year, have been non-contending teams in the first round of the playoffs. So, from a competitive standpoint, you look at it and say, "Geez, I mean, they're not getting much return on the interest here." Now, it does add some intrigue to the end of the regular season, and team makes the playoffs or whatever. But I don't think you look at the Bears, for instance, not like they could build on that. in 2021. They didn't build on it. Their coach and GM both got fired. Even if it bought them another year because they did make the playoffs, as it feels meaningless. It feels like a little more hollow when you go out as a 7th seed and then don't even contend. And that's certainly what happened here with the Steelers and the Eagles and in this first round. So, yeah, no, I'm sure at some point one of these 7 seeds is going to win a game. That's the NFL is sort of built on parity, and it's not like a 16 beating a 1 or something like that in the NCAA tournament. But certainly this year you saw another example of the competitive value return not being particularly great for this extra wild card.
Yeah, for sure. The good news is now we got rid of all of these sort of riffraff who don't really belong there. And the 4 games this weekend are a lot of fun. We got 4 great matchups. I think going through the slate is not an uncompelling game in the bunch. If you were sort of like power ranking, say, like which game interests you the most to the least, like how would you rank them?
Yeah, you're right. It was all chalk in the first round except for the Niners beating Dallas. And certainly Niners Green Bay will be interesting, but I do think the Packers will roll fairly easily in that game. The other games are very fascinating to me. I think I like Tampa over the Rams. I know I'm probably going to pick all chalk here. No, I won't. But in the NFC, I like Tampa over the Rams. That's an interesting one. But I think the 2 in the AFC are more interesting than either of them in the NFC. And certainly I would put the Green Bay game at the bottom and maybe the Rams and Tampa right there in the middle with Cincy and Tennessee. But I love the Buffalo-Kansas City game. I'm fascinated to see how that'll unfold, the rematch of the AFC Championship game. Just 2 awesome young quarterbacks. So that one really intrigues me. I'm most interested in watching that one. Cincinnati, Tennessee. Joe Burrow, such an awesome year. He was the number 1 rated quarterback by PFF. I think a lot of people don't really pay a ton of attention to the Bengals, but this guy's awesome. He had a great year. He was rated ahead of Tom Brady in PFF's ratings just by a little bit, but still ahead of him. I really think the Bengals can go into Nashville and beat this Titans team, which people who are kind of casual NFL fans say, well, Titans were the 1 seed in the AFC. The AFC feels wide open to me. I feel like I would not be surprised if the Bengals made the Super Bowl. I'm legitimately not surprised. I think they can beat Buffalo or Kansas City, and I certainly think they can beat the Titans. So while that one's interesting to me, I do think the Buffalo Kansas City game is more interesting. And heck, I'll probably wind up picking Buffalo and the Bengals. Why not? A little bit of a change of pace, and a little bit of an upset there, but I think probably chalk in the NFC. I think you're another Green Bay Tampa Bay NFC title game.
All right, there you have it, Darryl. Thanks for all the time. I really appreciate it. Before I let you go, how can people follow you on social media and keep up with your coverage for the Star Ledger?
Yeah, no problem. Happy to come on. So just Darryl Slater on Twitter, DarrylSlater, and then our website is nj.com/Giants or nj.com/Jets, and you'll find all of our NFL stuff there.
All right, I'll be sure to be following as you cover the Giants searches here to sort of rebuild our organization. Darryl, thanks for all the time. I really appreciate it.
No problem.